For hundreds of generations, we've looked to the night sky in wonder. Our remote ancestors could only explore the cosmos with their eyes and their imaginations, so the moon and planets were often associated with the gods, being divine in both their inaccessibility as well as their significance. Modern technology hasn't done much to change our perception of their significance, but it's certainly made them more accessible. Before the invention of the telescope, the moon was thought to be a perfect sphere, as was believed to be true of all celestial objects. But in the 1600s, the moon became a little less heavenly, when Galileo's observations revealed instead a diverse landscape of mountains and craters. News that the moon had a similar topography to Earth quickly spread, and speculation began about what life might exist there. By the 1800s, astronomers could view surface features of Mars as well, with some even believing they could see evidence of an alien civilization. People became fascinated with the idea of life on Mars. However, the thought of leaving Earth was only a distant fantasy. It wasn't until the 1900s that modern rocket technology began to emerge, with the United States launching the first liquid-fueled rocket in 1926. 18 years later, Germany was the first to send a rocket to space, and 17 years after that, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. Not to be outdone by the Soviets, it was in that same year John F. Kennedy announced the ambitious goal of putting a man on the moon. Although he didn't live to see it, 8 years later, in July of 1969, Apollo 11 turned fantasy into reality, when Neil Armstrong made his historic first step onto lunar soil. For the first time in history, sending humans to Mars felt possible. In fact, it seemed inevitable. As soon as the moon became achievable, Mars was also achievable in our minds. The future was bright. The impossible was becoming possible. Surely a spacefaring future was ahead of us. First stop Moon, next stop Mars. We can spread life to the solar system, nay, the galaxy. Build an empire to last thousands, millions of years. That's right, there's nothing we can't accomplish. The exploration of space will go ahead.
Whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time.
But more than 50 years later, since the end of the Apollo program, we've yet to send even a single astronaut beyond low Earth orbit. So, what happened? In the mid-1900s, there was quite the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And as with all good rivalries between superpowers, it motivated the creation of powerful rockets. The race to the moon was simply another arena for Cold War competition, and a way each nation could demonstrate its technological superiority. NASA was formed in 1958 with this in mind, and received as much as 4.5% of the federal budget in the years preceding the moon landing. Neil Armstrong's one small step was indeed a great victory, but once the race was won, the cost of the Apollo program came back into focus. The Apollo program cost $25 billion, which was 3 times higher than was originally estimated by the Kennedy government. Adjusted for inflation, that's $200 billion in today's dollars. Space was sold to the public as a great adventure for all mankind. But the American public was split. There were many who dreamed optimistically of a spacefaring future, with trips to Mars just around the corner. But in a time of civil unrest and economic inequality, there were some who felt there wasn't adequate justification for spending so much money in space. From the government's perspective, the race was already won, so a little skepticism was all it took for them to find reasons to cancel future missions. Probes and rovers were cost-effective and less risky, so they were favored for lunar and Martian exploration, and human missions, well, they didn't make it beyond low Earth orbit for the next 50 years. So it wasn't a lack of technology or public interest that prevented us from getting to Mars. It was a government that cared more about political posturing than it did about science and exploration. The Cold War eventually thawed, and then innovation in rocket technology just stagnated. The strategic arms limitation talks meant that missile production, including those used for space travel, was drastically reduced, and a few big players in the rocket industry gobbled up the remaining launch contracts, and then sat on a monopoly with little incentive for innovation or change. Today's NASA receives less than 0.5% of the federal budget. So is there any hope of getting back to the moon or onto Mars and fulfilling the dreams inspired by the moon landing over 50 years ago? One thing's clear. The cost of access to space needs to come down drastically.
Stage 1 is landed.
LZ-1, the Falcon is landed. Landing operators moving to procedure 11.100, section 3 on LZ-1B now.